All right, this is Ms. Kanan, and I'm going to answer some questions for Enija's research project.
Okay, so the first question I would like to ask you is, are you a homeowner?
I am not a homeowner.
Okay. Another question is, what is your personal definition of gentrification?
If I did define gentrification, I would say the act of people in power moving into and reclaiming an area that's been historically held by oppressed populations. Typically, this falls along race lines. So we have white people moving into areas that were historically predominantly people of color. But I think that can take many forms. But essentially, it's the appropriation by people in power of those spaces for their own benefit, and which end up forcing those people out so that the people in power can enjoy those spaces and all the benefits of them without the presence of the other people.
Okay, based off your definition, do you personally believe that gentrification is good or bad?
I personally think it's very harmful, very bad. I've seen a lot of the negative effects of it. I think that it's another tool of systemic oppression that gets used, and it's one that is a lot more difficult to identify and therefore can actually be a lot more dangerous than some of the other ones.
Personally, have you ever been impacted from gentrification? And if so, how, if you mind explaining?
Yeah, I would say as someone who used to live on the north side until very recently, I kind of indirectly experienced the results of gentrification, which being that like in an area that had previously been predominantly people of color many, many years ago and has now become a predominantly white area, the like average rent in that area just was too high for me to be able to live on, a working class budget. And so that's not the only reason I moved, but there's a little bit of a correlation there or a connection there of like, that is the white side of the city, as we're all very familiar with. It is the expensive side of the city, and I could not afford to live there anymore. So when I was moving further south to be closer to school, I would say my roommate and I, who are both white, thought a lot about what the impact would be. When we look at the south side, it's mostly people of color with a couple different pockets of predominantly white areas or more heterogeneous or diverse areas. And so we were considering places in both Bridgeport and Bronzeville, and one of the deciding factors for us was if we were to move to Bronzeville, we would be contributing to kind of the slow start of gentrification that's been happening there, which you can tell by like the appearance of things like Mariano's and a new fancy Jewel and like different things that are very obviously catering to a white population. And we instead chose to move to Bridgeport, which is actually a very diverse area, but it's historically white. And so we made a lot of jokes about the fact that we can't gentrify something that's already white. But it was actually a huge factor in our decision. We didn't want to be part of the problem there.
So how has moving impacted the way you view gentrification?
I would say that through the process of like moving and trying to pick a new neighborhood to live in, the biggest thing that I realized is that gentrification really is like a double-edged sword, because as two white people trying to do our best to not participate in like what we see as something really harmful, we realized towards the end that like we ended up what would happen for most people in that situation is that the alternative to not participating in gentrification is to remain and reinforce the lines of segregation that are in the city. So I think both of us started thinking a lot more about like the difference between diversification and gentrification and like how to balance that and how like we as individuals might not be able to, control what our presence does in an area, but how that's a really fine line you have to walk when you're attempting to diversify an area and kind of reduce that segregation within our city. And I think it's really hard to figure out how to do that without doing it the easiest way, which is, of course, gentrification, because then all the capitalists make more money.
Gentrification, they build around you, like a little bit at a time where you don't notice. Then everything around, like in the community, go up. Like, so for people who like struggling or like don't have like the finances to maintain or stay stable in the community, go move somewhere cheaper. This is what they want you to do, and they go raise your rent gonna go up, or the stuff in the stores gonna go up, and all the prices really gonna escalate and go higher where you can't afford it, which is gonna force you to move.
So do you think it's a good idea?
is it a good idea?
Yeah, gentrification.
It depends on what party you're talking about. It's a good idea for the people who can't afford it. It's not a good idea for the people who can't afford it but want to stay in their homes, you know? So it's like, they could ask people to do it, but they not gonna do it because that's where they reside, that's where they come from. So they force you without forcing you to do it by making you struggle, you know?
Yeah.
And that's basically why they do everything. They see something they want, like an area, they can't kick you out. That's against the law. Oh, your chips finna go up from $2 for $1 to $3 a bag. Then they go, oh, all these clothes finna go up, or your gas prices finna skyrocket, and your
The taxes
rent,
on your property.
yeah, the taxes gonna go up, and you finna start seeing extra taxes on your stuff, and your rent finna go up from $800 to $1,600. Then you smoke. Now you to Indiana you go, and you gonna see white people riding in, people who can afford it, lawyers, doctors in your crib where you was raised at.
Do you think gentrification is virtually good or bad?
I'm like in between. And the reason that I'm in between that is because the process of fixing up homes, you know, to meet middle class tastes, that's perfect. But when it affects the housing for African American people or people of color, you know what I'm saying, that's a problem. When they're being forced out of the areas because they can't afford to stay there anymore, because we have a lot of people who are of age, they're retired and things, and they depend on their disability benefits. Then you have single parent homes, and you know, mothers working 1 or 2 jobs just to provide for her family. And with the rent being the way that it is here in Chicago, it's already high. So, you know, it's a great idea. I love diversity, but I would wish that they would make it so that, you know, everybody could afford to stay, you know, and others don't have to move away, you know. Those are my views about it. It's a great idea as long as others are not affected and it affects homelessness, you know, causes homelessness with others, and, you know, that's it.
So, acknowledging the fact that there are positive things that happen when gentrification comes, such as like the decreasing crime, do you think that that's okay, like to push people out like their communities just to benefit off of like crime rates, having a crime rate decrease? Do you think that's sufficient?
Well, I don't feel as though that's fair, because every person's not a criminal. And you have people who resided in areas for years. They've not been a nuisance to society. They, you know, keep their properties and things of that nature. And, you know, when you're gentrifying, you're bringing in another race of people, and everything is going higher. You're building grocery stores, named grocery stores where there were none at first, you know, just to boost
Profits.
yeah. I don't think that it's fair, you know, for people who's lived there for so long to be ousted out because they can't keep up with what's going on. The economy booming in areas. I don't feel at all that is fair. So, you know, no, I don't think it's right. I think that they should grab a hold of what's going on and what's causing the crimes and deal with other areas in Chicago with the housing, the low income and things of that nature, and the Section 8. They should address that. Stop.
There's positives and negatives to gentrification. Obviously, the positives are, you know, there are new businesses, new real estate ventures. There's more opportunities, quote unquote, that come into the area. But typically, the bad part about gentrification is the neighborhood that has been gentrified. The people who were living there are forced out because of the gentrification. They can no longer afford to live there. So that is the negative impacts on gentrification. That's just one. Actually, like, if you look at Chicago, which is a great example, when they started gentrifying these areas, Cabrini Green, I.D. Wells projects, quite a few others, those people, they provided them Section 8 or quote unquote low income housing and forced them into neighborhoods where they wouldn't have normally lived together. And it causes gang wars because they're no longer fighting over this portion of the projects. They're fighting over this block in a neighborhood versus the block over. So there's good and bad for gentrification.